So warm welcome to this installment of the France-Singapore Science and Innovation Lecture Series. So the series is jointly organized by the French Embassy in Singapore, the Collège de France, and the National Research Foundation. And SNU is proud of hosting this event. So today's lecture will be given by Professor Philippe Aghion from the Collège de France, and is on the topic of creative destruction for green growth, which seems like a very timely topic. So there will be a Q&A session after the lecture. Since participants are muted, I invite you to ask your question by the chat function after the lecture. Please note that the session is recorded. So we have the pleasure to be joined today by His Excellency Marc Abansour, the Ambassador of France to Singapore, and by Professor Lily Kong, who is the President of the Singapore Management University. So before moving on to Professor Aghion's lecture, I would like to invite His Excellency and Professor Kong to say a few words. And we'll start with His Excellency.
Merci beaucoup. Professor Philippe Aghion, Professor Lily Kong, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to open this inaugural conference, which marks the third year of the France-Singapore Science and Innovation Lecture Series. It was an initiative which was launched during the Year of Innovation, France-Singapore, in 2018. And it's presently presented jointly by the Embassy of France, Collège de France, and the National Research Foundation in Singapore. And this partnership, which started in 2019, consists of lectures given by eminent professors coming from France to Singapore and also from Singapore to France. And over the course of this collaboration, we had the privilege to welcome the Professor Philippe Sansonetti in 2019, Professor Alain Fischer 2020, and Professor Pierre-Michel Menger in this year, just to name a few, and there were also others. So I'm pleased to say that despite the COVID-19, this partnership was able to reinvent itself, showing also the resilience and the determination of the France-Singapore scientific exchanges, and we proceeded online. But in light of the what is called vaccinated travel lane, which has been implemented starting recently, we hope very much, that we can resume also having these conferences and lectures in person, and that we will have in the future also professors traveling from France to Singapore and vice versa. So today's event is part of the 2021 edition of Voila, France-Singapore Festival. It has just been launched 3rd of November until December the 10th. And this year the festival gathers around 50 programs covering culture, education, lifestyle, but also science. And the thread, I would say, this year, it was to celebrate what we call the feel-good experience, the feel-good edition of Voila. So to share also about happy experiences with the audience. And there is in this Voila edition a core theme, which is sustainability. And so, as you know, whereas the COP26 is unfolding in Glasgow at the moment, we wanted also to recall that it's very important to offset our carbon emissions and to engage everyone on sustainability, climate change, and biodiversity. And for doing this, first we selected a series of 10 programs centered around sustainability and climate change, among which today's lecture by Professor Aghion. But we also decided to launch a new initiative, which is to make Voila the first carbon neutral international festival in Singapore by offsetting its carbon emission. And so we will track very carefully Voila energy consumption to define precisely, its carbon footprint. And this year and the next, we will compensate direct and some indirect carbon emissions with both green certificates and carbon offsets, and lower the greenhouse gases emitted during the current and future edition of this festival. Actually, we have concluded a partnership with a French company, Engie, not to mention it, for the next coming 3 years to proceed to make Voila carbon neutral. And it will be also the opportunity to exchange further with the Singaporean authorities, to exchange about best practices, to share the lessons learned of the first edition, and to proceed to a kind of cross-fertilization between French and Singaporean stakeholders on how to make these kind of events carbon neutral. To conclude, I would like, to express a warm thank you to our speaker today, Professor Philippe Aghion, chair in the Economics and Institution Innovation and Growth at the Collège de France, who accepted to deliver this lecture on creative destruction for green growth. More than ever before, concepts like innovation, capitalism, growth, and their compatibility with reducing the climate crisis are being discussed right now at the highest level at the COP26 in Glasgow. And France has set very clear climate goals for the next 3 decades, including reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. And we are happy to see Singapore joining the ranks of countries making also ambitious pledges towards a more sustainable future, with the announcement in Singapore of the Green Plan 2030. So I would also like to express my gratitude to Professor Lily Kong, President of Singapore Management University, for sharing the opening address with me and co-organizing this event. And finally, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Atos, which supports this year again, Voila, and today's lecture in particular. And last but not least, I wish all the participants a very fruitful exchange. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would now like to invite Professor Kong to say a few words as well.
Ambassador Mark Albonso, it's a lovely opportunity to see you again. Professor Philippe Aghion, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all and good morning to our friends in Paris. I'm pleased to join all of you at this online seminar as part of the France-Singapore Science and Innovation Lecture Series. The Singapore Management University's School of Economics is delighted and honored to be hosting Professor Aghion, whose work on innovation as a key driver for economic growth resonates strongly with our university's focus on innovation. Innovation is a key enabler to support and realize SMU's 3 cross-disciplinary strategic priorities of socio-economic relevance to our nation, the region, and globally. These 3 strategic priorities, of which innovation is a common thread, are as follows. 1, digital transformation, to spearhead innovative thinking and develop robust insights to help digitally transform the private and public sectors. 2, sustainable living, to drive innovative solutions in managing climate change, enhancing quality of life, and shaping frameworks for happier and healthier societies. And 3, growth in Asia, where innovation is the growth engine of Asia to contribute to the development of the region's economy, polity, and society, and managing its ensuing impacts. For these reasons, SMU has been expanding collaborations and deepening relations with leading French universities and industry partners in the innovation space over recent years. Our School of Computing and Information Systems had worked with Sorbonne University on a National Research Foundation and French National Research Agency funded collaboration to develop an automated process of transplanting source codes such as bug fixes or security patches and integrate new technologies to reduce costs and improve the reliability and security of IT systems. More recently, in June, SMU and HSA Paris signed an MOU to develop a more strategic partnership in innovation and entrepreneurship during the second meeting of the France-Singapore Joint Committee on Science and Technology. One of the key aims of the MOU is to catalyze technology transfer and commercialization activities in Singapore and France, and enable our respective cities to tap on each other as gateways to enlarge our footprint to bridge regional innovation ecosystems. Our first collaboration as the Asian partner for the ex-HSA Masters in Entrepreneurship program alongside UC Berkeley in the US is slated to begin in January next year. This will entail SMU hosting 20 HSA students who are keen to gain deeper insights into the workings of different entrepreneurship networks and develop useful contacts in the region. We look forward to sharing our knowledge on the local and regional innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems while mentoring the students on their startup journey in Singapore and beyond. SMU had also established a key partnership with LVMH, Moet Hennessy, Louis Vuitton via the LVMH SMU Asia Luxury Brand Initiative since 2014. Through SMU's Center for Marketing Excellence, this partnership aims to produce independent and high-quality academic research dedicated to the luxury brand sector and the Asian market. The third edition of the LVMH SMU Luxury Conference, the most recent of over 40 events organized over the course of this partnership, was launched virtually for the first time earlier in June. It brought together some 25 distinguished academic and industry leaders to discuss the future of luxury in Asia and the impact of AI, data, and innovation on the sector, and was attended by over 1,000 guests globally. Last but not least, our student exchange collaborations with French partner universities date back to SMU's establishment 21 years ago. Since then, we have exchanged almost 2,500 students with 14 French partner universities, including HSA Paris, Sciences Po, and Université Paris Dauphine. We look forward to continuing our healthy student traffic when travel resumes next year. I believe we, our students and faculty, have much to learn from each other about the power of innovation and its potential to address societal challenges for a better tomorrow. And this paves the way for new and increased collaborations in this common area of interest. Today's event adds to existing collaborations, which will enrich the tapestry of relations between institutes of higher learning and Singaporean and French communities at large. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to an insightful session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kong. So today we have the pleasure and the privilege to have Professor Philippe Aghion, and I'd like to say a few words to introduce him. So Professor Aghion is professor at the Collège de France, at the London School of Economics and at INSEAD. And in the past, he has held positions at institutions such as the University College of London, Harvard University, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also the recipient of many prestigious awards, including the Earl Janssen Award for the Best European Economist under the age of 45, the John Feuerman Award, and more recently the BBVA Frontier of Knowledge Award, joined with Peter Howitt. Professor Aghion's research spans numerous topics, and is best known for his work on innovation, competition, and the process of growth through creative destruction. Today, he will talk about creative destruction for green growth. And so, as has been highlighted several times, with global warming and its consequences becoming more apparent each year, this is clearly an important and urgent topic. And with the United Nations Climate Change Conference taking place right now in Glasgow, it is also very timely. So I now would like to invite Professor Aghion to give his address.
Thank you. So, thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks, Your Excellency, and all of you, and Lily, and Nicolas, to invite me to give this. So it's true, I have a close link with Singapore because I am professor at Collège de France, but also at INSEAD. And as a professor at INSEAD, we have weekly seminars, which are totally dual with Singapore. So I am constantly in link with Singapore through INSEAD. Okay, so it's let me share screen. Voila, here we go. Okay, and then let's do this. Okay, very good. So I will talk about my recent book, The Power of Creative Destruction, which is published at Harvard University Press, but it's been translated in a number of languages. So it's Harvard University Press, but it just came out in China last week. And so it's and I call it Rethinking Capitalism: The Power of Creative Destruction. So the book is joined with Céline Antonin, who is a researcher at Sciences Po and Collège de France with me, and with Simon Bunel, who is a researcher at Banque de France, INSEE, and Collège de France with me. Let me just do this. So here is Schumpeter at a young age, I think. Okay, and so creative destruction is it's a notion that introduced by Schumpeter. It refers to the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. New innovations make old technologies obsolete. But there was no model of growth by Schumpeter. There was no empirics by Schumpeter. So we had to build from scratch a new growth paradigm. When I studied growth, we would study the Solow model, which is a very elegant model, but nothing to do with this. And that's all we had, at hand. And so we had to build a whole new paradigm. So in 1987, with Peter Howitt, we constructed a growth model, a Schumpeterian growth model, based on the three following ideas. First one is that long-run growth is driven by cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon the shoulders of our predecessor. The second idea is that innovations result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. When you innovate, you get monopoly rents for a while because you do better products than others or new product. And for a while, at least, you get monopoly rents from it. And that's what rewards innovation. And that is the prospect of those rents that encourages you to invest in innovation. And the third one is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies. New innovations make old technologies obsolete. And you can see right away that at the heart of the growth process, you have a contradiction. On the one hand, you need these monopoly rents to motivate innovators, to motivate entrepreneurs to invest in innovation. But on the other hand, those rents can be used ex post to prevent future innovations. Because you see, yesterday's innovators, they will want to block subsequent innovation because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction by others. You see, regulating capitalism, it's all about this contradiction. And in fact, through the whole book, whether you talk about secular stagnation, middle income trap, inequality, green growth, you are always coming across this contradiction. That on the one hand, you need monopoly rents, the innovation rents to motivate innovative activity. On the other hand, there is this big temptation to use these rents to prevent subsequent innovation. And in fact, Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism because he thought that the innovators would turn into conglomerates that would block subsequent innovation. But in fact, in the book, we just say that, instead of being pessimistic as Schumpeter, we advocate Gramsci optimism of the will, the fighting optimism. We think there are ways around that. Schumpeter is right to be concerned by this, but there are ways to mitigate his pessimism. So what the book does is to use the lens of creative destruction and the growth paradigm that I just outlaid to do three main things. First, to revisit some main enigmas in economic history. Second, to question some common wisdoms. Three, to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me go through those three in turn. Some historical enigma. The first enigma is industrial takeoff. You see, we know through the work particular of Madison and others that essentially growth took off in Europe in 1820, first in England, then France, then US. But it was first in Europe and then went to US. But until 1800, GDP per capita worldwide, there is not much happening. You have some growth episodes here and there, but they are never lasting and never very important. It's really the takeoff is in 1820 in Europe. And that's very surprising. Why in Europe? And so recently, I mean, growth is 200 years old. Human beings as we know them are, human is at more than 10,000. And if we look at Sapiens, it's much more, and Neanderthal is much, much more. And growth is only 3 times my age. I'm old, but it's all 200. I'm 65. So it's slightly more than 3 times my age. It's nothing. And why in Europe? Why not in China, where you had so many innovations, inventions? The wheel was, la roue was invented in China, the compass, many great inventions were done in China or elsewhere. Why did you see, why isn't that growth takeoff took place in China, for example? And in chapter 2 of the book, we explain Joel Mokyr in particular is very important in that respect. And what's very important with Joel Mokyr is that his explanation for why the takeoff took place in Europe in 1820 and not in China in long before, it has very much to do with the paradigm that I outlined here. First, you had institutions for cumulative growth, for cumulative innovation. You had universities, you had openness, you had a free society of science already there, and you had the encyclopedia, which codified knowledge, the Encyclopedia Britannica and the French encyclopedia with Diderot, which codified knowledge. And so you didn't have to reinvent everything each time. You would avoid the Sisyph myth because you could codify knowledge. So you had institutions for cumulative innovation. The second thing is that you had institutions to protect property rights on innovation. You had the Glorious Revolution in England, and in France, the French Revolution, and then Bonaparte, who set up institutions that would protect property rights on innovation. And that was very important to have innovation going. And the third thing is that you had creative destruction. In China, whenever you would have a dangerous, you would have a successful inventor, the emperor would try to, inhibit this inventor, because the emperor would be afraid of losing power to this inventor. And in Europe, you could not do that, because if you would persecute a scientist in France, the scientists would flee to England or to Prussia or to Switzerland or elsewhere and develop the innovation there and compete with France. So the fact that you had competition between several countries in Europe favored the creative destruction. So it's very interesting that you see the paradigm does a very good job at explaining why the growth started in Europe in 1820 and not elsewhere before. Another enigma is the secular stagnation. Very interesting that if you look at annual average TFP growth, TFP, it's total factor productivity growth, you can see that that's in the US. Between 95 and 2005, you have high TFP growth in the US, but since 2005, growth has declined a lot. And it's declined a lot despite the IT revolution and the AI revolution, the artificial intelligence. And that's a kind of enigma. How come those guys, IT and AI, should give you enormous amount of growth, and you don't see that in the US? Very interesting, by the way, that the boost and then the decline in growth, you observe that mainly in the IT producing sectors in the US, so that's the black curve, and the IT using sectors, which is the gray curve. And there, the story which we develop in chapter 6 of the book is that with the IT revolution, it facilitated the emergence of superstar firms like Walmart, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and all these guys, Facebook later on. And those firms, they expanded. They were very well organized, very productive. And of course, when they expanded, that boosted growth. And that's the boost of growth that you have here. But then subsequently, when these firms invaded many sectors of the economy, it inhibited entry and growth by other firms. And that's why you had the decline. So that's very much the Schumpeterian fear. Innovators of yesterday becomes barrier to innovation for others later on. And what we explain in chapter 6 is that the big problem in the US is the competition policy. Competition policy did not adapt to the digital era. And you need to adapt competition policy. I know that the Biden administration has enacted very important competition reforms, and I think they go in the right direction. You need to adapt competition policy to make sure, for example, that you cannot do merger and acquisition without limit, that you factor in, the effect that those merger and acquisition would have on subsequent growth and entry. So you see the difference with Schumpeter is that here we say, well, there is a problem with competition policy, but you can change it. And you can elect a new president who will then change competition policy. And so that's my Gramscian optimism instead of being, pessimistic. So that's but you see, again, is the Schumpeterian world there. Huh? The third enigma is the middle income trap. That's very interesting and very close to Asia. South Korea grew very fast between 1945 and I would say the early 90s. And then growth slowed down in Korea. Japan is not a middle income. Japan is an advanced country, but Japan grew very fast up to the late 80s. And then Japan stopped growing. What happened? And then we describe that in chapter 7 of the book. We say, well, what happened is that the growth of Korea and the growth of Japan was very much a catching up growth. And they had institutions for catching up. And but during this catching up growth, you had the emergence of big conglomerates. And you call them chaobols in Korea, you call them keiretsus in Japan. And these conglomerates, not only they prevented entry of new firms, but they also put pressure on governments to not move to institutions that would be good for frontier innovation. You see, you can grow either by catching up with the frontier technology or by yourself doing frontier innovation. And those big conglomerates, were barriers to not only entry, but also to shifting to policies that would be more conducive of frontier innovation. For example, competition policy or labor market flexibility or those things. And that partly explains why you had the middle income trap. China is a bit concerned with the middle income trap because they grew very fast. Growth is a little bit slowing down. And they're also concerned about that. They say we were very good to catch up. We want to make sure we are very good as frontier innovators. They do pretty well on innovation, but they are still not totally frontier innovators. I'm teaching on China this afternoon at college. And so the question is, will China get into the middle income trap or will China be able to avoid the middle income trap? And that's a big question. Another enigma is the source and dynamics of inequality. We know that the share of income of the top 1% income earners has gone up a lot since the 1980s in developed countries. The work of Piketty, Saez, Atkinson. It turns out that innovation is a source of top income inequality. Here, it's work that I've done with co-authors, Blandel, Aksigit, Bergeau, Remus, on cross-US panel. And we show that when a US state in the US is more innovative, has more innovation, the share of income of the top 1% income earners in that state is bigger. So there is clearly an effect of innovation on top income inequality. Is because when you get innovation, when you innovate, you get rents from innovation. So that allows you to get to the top income brackets. But you see, what's very interesting is that innovation does not increase global inequality measured by the Gini. So that's very interesting. And why is that? It's because it's true that on the one hand, innovation increases top income inequality. But on the other hand, innovation also increases social mobility. Social mobility is the extent to which if a child is born to a poor family, the child becomes rich. And innovation helps social mobility. Why? Because of creative destruction. Creative destruction, you have new talents replacing old talents. That's an engine of social mobility. But also because more innovative firms, here we show the wage of an unskilled worker in an innovative firm, which is in the continuous curve, and in a non-innovative firms, which is the dotted curve. And you see that the innovative firm pays better and also offers a steeper wage profile to a non-skilled worker. So you see, innovation is good not only because of creative destruction, but also because innovative firms provide better what we call good jobs, jobs that promote, jobs that offer good career prospects to their workers. Now, that's to be contrasted with another source of inequality at the top, which is lobbying and entry barriers. And in chapter 5 of the book, we really contrast, innovation as a source of inequality and entry barriers and lobbying as a source of inequality, because lobbying and entry barriers also increase the share of income of the top 1%, but they reduce social mobility because they reduce entry. And therefore, because they reduce social mobility, they reduce growth. And so lobbying and entry barriers, it's all bad because it increases top income inequality. It reduces growth because it prevents entry. And because it reduces social mobility, it increases global inequality as well. So if instead of intensity of innovation, I would put lobbying here, you would see both the continuous curve and the dotted curve moving upward. So I say always, you should not treat Steve Jobs like Carlos Slim. Steve Jobs has become rich because he innovated. Carlos Slim became rich because he became head of Telecom de Mexico, Telmex, which is an unregulated private monopoly for telecom in Mexico. Okay, so that's a bad way to become rich. The good way is to innovate, and you should not treat both the same way. It's very important when you look at rents, if you see whether the rents come from innovation or if the rents come from entry barrier and lobbying. And that we talk a lot about that in chapter 5. Okay. Okay, are you still alive? Let's take 1 minute of pause and I talk about the second thing that the book does. So the second thing that the book does is to question common wisdoms, to question bad, what we call in French, fausses bonnes idées. I mean, ideas that look good and they are not good, in fact. Okay. So one such idea is that you should tax robots to protect employment. Very bad idea, very bad. In work with the same co-authors as in the book, Céline Antonin, Simon Bunel, and also Xavier Jaravel, we look, and we talk about that in chapter 3 of the book, we look at the effect of automation on employment. Firm level French, we have a wonderful, exhaustive French level database. And we see that French firms that automate, they increase employment. So here is the time where you do the automation. Employment goes up right away and keeps going up further later. That's at the level of the factory, of the plant. But you can look at the level of the firm. Okay. And why is that? So you might think that it's strange. I mean, how come you replace man by machines and you increase employment? How can that be? Yeah, it's because you see, you have what we call a productivity effect. Firms that automate, they are able to lower their export price, their price. They become more productive. And so they can produce at lower cost, or the quality adjusted, or they produce this, higher quality for the same price, but the quality adjusted price goes down. Because of that, sales go up. So they can increase their sales worldwide. And because they increase their sales worldwide, there is bigger demand for their product, and therefore they employ more. You see, the productivity effect more than counteracts this substitution effect. By the way, this explains why none of the big revolutions in history, be it the steam engine or the electricity revolution, each time there was the fear that those revolutions would produce mass unemployment. But that never happened because each time you had a productivity effect that more than counteracted the substitution effect. Okay, so taxing robots would be a very bad idea because you would make it harder for firms to automate and therefore to expand sales and therefore to employ more. So you would shoot yourself in the feet. Bad idea. So forget about taxing robots. Another idea, which we look at in chapter 13 of the book, is protectionism would be the way to regain control of value chains. France, for example, COVID, and I will show that later, I will show that now, in fact, France, has outsourced too much, and France has lost too much control of its value chains. And the ambassador knows that very well, of course, okay? But the way out is not to do trade wars, is not to do protectionism, is to innovate. Here, let's look here. Here, it's France versus Germany. In black, you have Germany. The triangles are the exports. The circles are the imports. And the gray curves are for France. And those are for what I call COVID products, anti-COVID products, masks, respirators, and tests. It is all what we needed before the vaccine. And you see that in these products, Germany and France were more or less the same in 2000. But you see that Germany has increased a lot its exports, increased also its imports. So Germany didn't put entry barriers. It just innovated. France outsourced. And France stopped innovating much, you see. And you can see the problem with France. Here you have medical technologies and pharmaceuticals and biotech. And zero is the frontier, technological frontier. France was very close to the frontier in 95. And look, we deteriorated so much. And France deteriorated in all sectors except nuclear and aircrafts. In almost everywhere else, France has outsourced and given up on innovation and industrialization. Dramatic, dramatic. But what we have to do is not to do protectionism, because if France were to put tariff barriers like Mrs. Le Pen wants to do, that would be traumatic, because that would close export markets to France. And because it would close export markets to France, it would reduce the incentives of French firms to innovate. Because if you do trade wars, of course, the destination countries would retaliate and they will close export markets, and therefore you will innovate less. And that's what we explain in chapter 13. Is the only way out is to innovate more, to invest much more in innovation and to reindustrialize through innovation. And that's the 2030 plan that Macron proposed 2 weeks ago, on which Eli Cohen and myself worked a lot. Okay, so that's the idea to do, you see, but not to do protectionism. Another idea, which is bad, is that negative growth should be the way to fight climate change. Okay, and that's a very bad idea. You know, in fact, COVID was a natural experiment, because, in 2020, we had the first lockdown in France between March and June 2020. GDP went down by 35%, but CO2 emissions went down by 8%. If you wanted to just have negative growth to stop climate change, you should maintain France in the first lockdown. But the first lockdown had dramatic effects. Many young people had psychological problems in France now. And we know the dramatic effect that the lockdown had on developing countries. When developed countries lock down, you have many high mortality growth in developing countries, not so much because of COVID, but because of the starvation. Because in fact, the recession that it provoked in developing countries induced much more starvation, and many people died from starvation. Is that what we want? No. The way out, and that we explained that in chapter 9, the whole chapter 9 of the book is on green growth, is the way out is to have green innovation. Alors now you will say, well, why that's firms that innovate. You're right, but firms do not spontaneously innovate in green technologies. We show, and we explain that in chapter 9 of the book, that firms that used to innovate in polluting technologies in the past, for example, in combustion engines in the past, will continue spontaneously to innovate in combustion engines. You see, they will not spontaneously shift to green technologies. That's what we call path dependence in the direction of technical change. So, so that implies first also that creative destruction helps you there, because new firms, of course, by definition, do not face the path dependence problem. There is no past for them. They are just new, and they will go right away to green technologies. So creative destruction will help you there. But also the state can intervene to redirect the technical change of the firms. How? The carbon tax, but of course, we should not do it like we did in France 3 years ago with the yellow vest movement. We have to do a smart, carbon tax. So that's not easy to do smart carbon tax. It's much more complicated than we think. You have to compensate a number of losers, a number of people who don't have the option to use other transportation than cars, for example. So you have the carbon tax is an instrument, but also subsidizing green innovation is another one, and industrial policy. For example, France contributes to global CO2 emissions by only 0.8%. Why? Because we have the nuclear plants and we need the nuclear. Germany made a dramatic choice by closing their nuclear plants. It was a silly choice. I like very much Angela Merkel, but that was a very silly idea to close nuclear plants because without the nuclear, France would be very much more polluting. Alors, we need to, of course, do research on other sources like nuclear fusion, for example, or like hydrogen, or like, other sources, like, of course, eolians and renewables energy. But we need also to maintain the nuclear as long as we don't have better sources of energy. And so that's why you need to think energy transition smartly, carbon tax, subsidize clean innovation, pursue, encourage innovation on all kinds of new sources of energy, but maintain nuclear because it's a very good way to have, carbon-free energy. And I'd say the state can do a lot through carbon tax and smart industrial policy for energy, okay? But also civil society can play a big role. And the name and shame there, B Corp and all that plays a big role. And we also talk about that in chapter 9. We show how in countries where consumers worry about the environment, competition pushes firms to innovate green. Because if I don't, Mark will. You see what I mean? And so it's very interesting that the combination of education, for that consumers know about the climate problem, combined with competition, that combination is equivalent to a huge increase in carbon price. So that's yet another instrument that you can use to speed up green innovation, you see? And so all the levels of green innovation, and it's very much the triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. This triangle is crucial for the success of, to fight climate change. Firms that innovate, the state, and civil society. Those three are very important to stop climate change. Okay, so now I get to the last part, rethinking capitalism. 1 minute pause for Philippe. Okay, so we think, the book wants to help rethink capitalism. COVID was a revelator. It revealed weaknesses of capitalism different from one country to another country. In the US, COVID revealed a broken social model, and I will be more precise in a moment. In Europe, it revealed weaknesses of the ecosystem of innovation, and I will come back to that. So let me be more precise. In the US, here I show US versus Germany. The gray curves are US and the black one are Germany. The triangles are the unemployment rates. You see unemployment going up a lot with COVID in US, much less in Germany, okay? But the problem also is that in the US, when you lose your job, you have a non-negligible probability of losing health insurance. And so the curve, the gray curve with the circles, is the fraction of US population without health insurance. You can see that it went down with Obamacare. So Obamacare was a good reform because it lowered the share of American citizens without health insurance. That's what Trump wanted to undo. And you can see that with COVID, the share of America, at the time when they needed health insurance, a non-negligible fraction of US population lost health insurance. Whereas in Germany, the share of population without health insurance is zero throughout. So Germany does a much better job of ensuring, of providing health insurance when you face a shock like COVID, where you need health insurance. Same if I look at poverty rate. Here now, the circles are the share of individuals at risk of poverty. That share didn't move in Germany. It remains constant through the COVID. It went up a lot because when you lose your job in the US, you are much more likely to fall into poverty because you have poor unemployment insurance system. So US is a bad social model. And that's what Biden needed to give checks to people there because they didn't do a good job at protecting. In France, we did quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it costs. We protect people, okay, when you have a shock like COVID. But on the other hand, that's the downside of the US model, okay? Bad social model. But on the other hand, it's a very good on innovation. You see here, I show the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants in the US, much more, it's much higher than in EU 27 or OECD average. And if I were to show the highly cited patents or the triadic patents, which are the high quality patents, the discrepancy between US and the other countries would be even much bigger. So US are very good at innovating. Why? Because they have a fantastic ecosystem for innovation. We describe that ecosystem in chapter 12 of the book. They have, for example, in biotech, for basic research, they have the National Science Foundation, which is very well funded. They have the National Institute of Health. They have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a sponsors institute that finances also basic research. They have very well financed universities, all that for basic research. But they also have very developed venture capital. They have institutional investors. And they have the BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. If we are there today, if I can resume my classes at college, it's very much thanks to BARDA. Thank you, BARDA. Thank you. BARDA, what they did, money comes from the American government. They name team leaders. The team leaders approach a number of labs that they put in competition, and they do private-public partnership. And they tell them, we take the risk on us. You fail, no problem. We take the risk. BARDA spent $12 billion last year on vaccine, essentially to develop the vaccine. BARDA, the basic technology existed. It was ARN messenger. But you had to turn ARN messenger in 1 year into mass production of vaccines. Only BARDA could make that happen. We don't have BARDA in France. We don't have BARDA in Europe. And that's what we miss badly. And it was very important. You see, so the ecosystem of innovation on all grounds, being from the basic research, venture capital, institutional investors, the BARDA, we are well below the efficiency frontier in Europe. We can do a lot, and France, let alone France, I mean, we have everything to do better. You know, basic research in France is dramatically underfunded. Me, I'm at Collège de France. I need to teach in 2 other places to have a decent salary, in addition to Collège de France. Voilà. That's for you to know. When I went from Harvard to Collège, my salary was divided by 4. You see what I mean? That's basic research in France. Okay. So that's very important to know. You see, when BARDA spent $12 billion, European Commission plus EIB spent a total of $4 billion. You see? So that's the thing. So what you would like is to have a capitalism that combines the good side of the American model, innovative, with the good side of the European model. I like very much the Danish model, to be honest with you, which is protective and inclusive. Some people believe that it's either or. If you choose to be innovative, you need to renounce protection and inclusion. If you want to be protective and inclusive, you need to renounce being innovative. I believe this is not right. I believe that there are at least 3 policies that are good, that make you both more innovative and more inclusive and protective. Let me talk about them. It is flex security on the labor market, education, and competition. So let me talk about flex security first. That's from Case and Deaton, and we talk about that in chapter 11 of the book. We show, you see, that mortality of the middle-aged, unskilled, white non-Hispanics in the US, mortality went up a lot since 2000. Why? Because they fear unemployment. Why? Because if you become unemployed, as I told you, you may lose health insurance, everything, you lose status, you lose income, everything becomes more complicated for your family. There is a probability that your family will dismantle your people. And that's why when they, by fear of unemployment or when they become unemployment, American citizens go into opioids, sleeping pills, and all kinds of things. You see what I mean? And antidepressants. And they die more. And not in other countries. And so that's because of the social model that I was talking before. But in Denmark, as my friend Alexandra Roulet, a colleague at INSEAD, shows, is that in Denmark, losing your job has no effect on the purchase of antidepressants, anti-anxiety and sleeping pills, no effect on the probability to visit hospital for circulatory problems, no effect on mortality. Why? Because the Danes invented flex security. When you lose your job in Denmark, for 2 years, you get 90% of your salary. The state helps you find a new job and retrains you. And of course, then you have to accept a job in your qualification. If you refuse more than 2 jobs, you lose your subsidies, okay? But that's a very good system because it makes creative destruction work better. So it made the Danish economy much more innovative because they could manage creative destruction better, but it also made the Danish system more protective. So here is a reform that both makes you more innovative and more protective. Let me go now to education. Here, chapter 10 of the book, we show the probability of inventing as a function of parental income. That's in the US with the recent data. That's in the US with historical data. And that's in Finland, which is much more egalitarian than the US. But still, having parents that earn more makes a big difference for probability of becoming an inventor. Why is that? In fact, in Finland, it's a lot because it's not because school is expensive. In Finland, school is totally free. But it's because the higher earners' parents are also more educated parents. And so what they do is that they transmit education and aspirations to their children. And so when you control for parental education, you see that the relationship becomes much flatter. You see, you go from the blue to the red. That means that if you invest in very widespread, inclusive education for many generations, you will get these curves to flatten out. And to have, so what does that mean? When you have curves like this, it means that you have what we call lost Einsteins. You have smart children born to poor families, and therefore they will not become inventors because they will not have the knowledge or the aspiration required to become inventors. There are many potential inventors that we are losing when we have a curve like this. Investing in education, in inclusive education for many generations will make us reduce the number of lost Einsteins. We will have many more people who can become inventors. And that will make the economy both more innovative because many more people can innovate, but also more inclusive by definition. Here is again a policy that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive. And the last one is competition. Remember when I talk about the secular stagnation, I said that the US growth went down because the GAFAMs and the big superstar firms inhibit innovation by others, and they abuse competition rules. If you reform competition policy in the US, you will make the economy more innovative because you will have more entrant innovation by non-superstar firms, but you will also make growth more inclusive because we know that entrant innovation, that's creative destruction, that's what drives social mobility. And so competition is also a policy that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive. So at the end of the day, what's crucial is the triangle between firms that innovate, the state, and civil society. Going back to Schumpeter's pessimism, Schumpeter was concerned that the previous inventors would turn into conglomerates that would block new innovation. One way out is to have the state. The state would say, well, I have competition policy that I can do, or I can, but of course, the state could be captured by the firm. The firms could buy out the executive power. One response is to say, let's have Montesquieu, let's have separation of power, let's have the executive power be controlled by the judiciary power. But unfortunately, the constitution is an incomplete contract. Colombia has the same constitution as France, but Colombia is a very different country from France in reality, you see, because the constitution is an incomplete social contract. And you need civil society to make sure that the contract is enforced. That's why civil society is very important. I already talked about this triangle when I talked about green policy. I said you have firms that innovate green, the state that can do carbon tax and industrial policy, and civil society with the consumer. But even to deal with innovation, to make growth sustainable and sustained, you need the triangle. You see, so the idea there is, and that we talk in chapter 15 of the book, constitutions are incomplete contracts. The civil society plays a crucial role as a means of ensuring the effective enforcement of this contract. A very good example is the civil rights movement in the US. You had the Civil War, la guerre de sécession, in the 19th century. After the guerre de sécession, you had the Americans introduced the 15th Amendment that would give African Americans the right to vote. Okay, but this right was never enforced because southern states in the US would prevent African Americans from voting, having literacy tests and poll tax. And it took the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s for the Supreme Court to introduce the Voting Act in 1965 that would make it, illegal, lawless, you see, to have the literacy test in the southern state. And only after 1965 could the African Americans in the southern states of the US actually vote. It took 100 years and civil society movement to make something that was constitutional become reality. You see, so that's okay. So that's I stop there, and I want to and I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Aghion.
Okay, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Thank you very much. So now we'll take questions. So for those of you who have questions, please enter your question in the chat function.
Could you hear me? Was it okay? You could hear me when I was speaking?
I hear you perfectly well.
Okay.
So let me start then with a question.
Yes, yes.
So talking about innovation for getting greener technologies.
Yeah.
One issue is the timing, because we want to make sure that climate change doesn't get too bad. And
yeah.
So how could we make sure that the innovation happen fast enough?
I think the way to reason is to do whatever we can. I think one way, I mean, you see, so first is to give some objectives. I hope there will be more coming from the COP26. Already the thing on forest, on methane, on, no carbon, the fuel, the carbon, the agreement on the carbon plants. I mean, anything that can be done is good. I think we should reason in the way to say, let's give, I was hoping that we would also have, you see, like the BARDA, you said, in 1 year, everybody should be vaccinated. I was hoping you should have a DARPA energy, create the equivalent of BARDA for energy in Europe, for example, to say, to achieve objectives like no electric, no fuel cars produced after 2030 or 2026, no trucks with fuel in big metropoles in Europe or in other parts of the world after that date, no transports that are not electric after that date. You see what I mean? You should do as much as you can on the same mode as you did with BARDA for vaccine, and have the equivalent of a BARDA for energy to make sure that those guys are available. because you see, it's one thing to say we do, and carbon tax is not the same thing, because the rich people pay the carbon tax, you know. So the carbon tax is a good instrument, it's not enough. You need to have the equivalent of the BARDA and have very clear objectives. You know, no more Paris, no more cars which are non-electric or whatever, or non-hydrogen after 20, whatever. So these kind of things, you see. I think that would be very important.
Thank you. So there is a question here about the key differences and similarities of your triangle with the narrow corridor described by Acemoglu and Robinson.
Yeah. Me, I was much more the Bowles Carlin, you know, Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin. And so I was very much more inspired by them directly. But it's true that I think the argument, if I remember well, we mentioned, by the way, the work of Daron and Jim Robinson in the book, so we mentioned them. They try to say that if you have too much of one and not enough of the other, things go wrong. But they don't look very much at innovation and creative destruction, as far as I know. So what I argue is that you need the triangle to have sustained growth. So we really look at innovation. We really look at the Schumpeter concern, and we are really focused on innovation. Whereas they were not, I don't think they were so much focused on innovation in their book, as far as I remember. In fact, I mean, you know, we have big debate with Daron. Daron used to believe in creative destruction. Now, I don't know if he ever believes in this. I don't know exactly where he is on this, to be honest. I don't know.
Thank you. So we have a question. So you said protectionism would prevent innovation.
Yeah, would not be good for innovation. Yeah, absolutely.
And it would also have an impact on buying power. So what about the impact of protectionism on transportation carbon footprint and ensuring sovereignty over critical industries and ensuring industrial jobs for non-qualified people? Yeah,
so there are several things there. There is one instance where you may want to at least use the threat of a tariff barrier. Suppose that some countries become virtuous on environment and decide to implement very strong policies to fight climate change. Then there might be the temptation of some firms to outsource their activities that are polluting to what I call pollution heavens, to countries that say, come, we don't care about pollution, come and produce in our countries and then re-export elsewhere. In fact, when I mentioned that France contributes only to 0.8% to CO2 emission, is a lot because of nuclear. It's also because France did a lot of outsourcing. And France outsourced activities that would be polluting to places that would accept the pollution. So that we don't accept, because then in that case, you should say no, to prevent pollution heavens, you should use the threat of carbon tariffs, you see? But you have to be very careful when you do it, because you don't want to fall completely in protectionism. So you have to limit it to, for example, steel production, to very basic industries that are directly polluting. So you have to do that very carefully. You see what I mean? So because you don't want this to be a pretext for protectionism, you really want to do it to prevent pollution heavens. So if tariffs have to be used, is to prevent social dumping or environmental dumping, but not for other things. No. Not for other purposes.
Thank you. There is another question about the role of taxes, because they can be used for redistribution, and so to reduce inequality, but at the same time, they can stifle innovation.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I explained chapter 5. That chapter 5 is all about that.
So how can we?
So the view that we have
taxes
there, so we need to tax. That's the chapter 5. We discussed that. That's what I like very much the Scandinavians, to be honest, because of course they tax people. I believe in a reasonably progressive taxation on labor income, okay? And I think you need to tax because you need to finance public services. If you want to have a good education system, a good health system, you need to raise tax. I mean, you can't do that without, okay? So you need taxation, and you need fair taxation, and you need to have a fairly redistributive taxation. So I agree on that. France, for example, is very redistributive taxation. If you compare the pre-tax income distribution and the post-tax income distribution, you see there's huge difference between the two. And I think it's good that we have the system we have in France, okay? And we have also good inheritance tax in France. And I am in favor of inheritance tax, okay? So, but on the other hand, as we say in French, trop d'impôt tue l'impôt. You have what we call the Laffer curve. Too much tax, kills discourages innovation. So you have to do the tax smartly. And also when you look at rents, to distinguish between rents that come from innovation, from rents that don't come from innovation, but from lobbying and entry barriers, that also has to be done. So you have to, I believe in taxation, I believe in redistribution, I believe in public services. I'm a good, but you have to do it in a way that does not kill innovation. You see, for example, when Sweden did the tax reform they did in the early 1990s, and we talk about that in chapter 5, they maintained their social model, but they boosted innovation and growth by doing that.
We have someone asking about how can the flexi-security system that we see in Denmark, how can it be replicated in other economies and remain sustainable given the competition forces that we see around the world?
Well, I think, I think it can be. I think you need, of course, I mean, the difficulty to have that is you need a good training system. You need a good training system, and you need to have good, the unemployment agencies, because you need to follow unemployed individuals, to follow them and help them. So you need very well trained. In Denmark, the people who are in charge of that do 4 years of study after high school to study that precisely. So you need to train people to do that. I think it's good to do that at regional level. It's much more efficient. Denmark is a small country. Maybe it's better to do that at regional level and to have very well trained people to follow. We call them Pôle emploi in France, but Pôle emploi is not at all the Danish forces. So it's a big investment, but it's a good investment because you make the economy more innovative by doing that. So it's an investment. It costs money, but it's a cost, like an investment is a cost, like an education system is a cost. I think it's worth doing.
Thank you. So we have another question about car manufacturers. And so the question is about being surprised that, given that established car manufacturers have the technology to produce hybrid cars, they do not seem to be pushing that much more in that direction of more electricity, even though they seem to now have the technology.
Yeah, because that's why you need the state. That's why you need the state. Firms will not do it spontaneously, and you need the state and civil society both to push them. So the state so for example, if there are rules, if municipalities say, we don't accept in Paris, for example, non-electric cars after that year, that will be a big incentive. And if all big metropoles, I believe in countries, but I believe also in metropoles. If big metropoles agree to that, that will have a big effect on car manufacturers. And also, I believe very much in civil society, the name and shame. Now you have B Corp. B Corp, it's a thing where good firms, consumers know about more and more about which firms are virtuous and which firms are non-virtuous, both in their output and in their inputs. And I hope that increasingly that will play a role as well. So I believe in the role of state and civil society with good information. And I think we can go very far with that. And competition, because that's where competition is important. If you had only one car manufacturer, you could say, look, you don't like me, but you have no choice. You have to buy a car from me. If there is a competitor who does, clean cars, but then, and consumers are aware, they will go to the more virtuous firm. So I think all those guys, anything you can try is good. Competition, information, the state, green finance, all that is very important.
Thank you. So we have another question about China and the fact that they seem to be implementing a more controlled approach on innovation rents, and trying to redistribute resources. So if I can rephrase the question,
yeah.
do you think that they are taking a right approach, or should they be doing things differently?
Look, I'm always very careful when I talk about China. It's a country, some people believe that China was like Zambia, I don't want to name any people that you named before, but so I don't want to name them myself, wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. And they describe China like the equal Zambia, the same as, and China did much better than many people expected. I mean, when you look at innovation, they went pretty far close to the frontier innovation in many areas. So it's amazing the performance of China on innovation. They are not frontier, okay? And it's true that if they tighten too much, there might be a danger of going back, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's true that it's good to have freedom and it's good to have checks and balances, because if you don't have checks and balances, corruption may go up. Although Xi Jinping came to fight corruption. So we have to see whether at the end of the day, corruption is going up or down in China. If corruption goes down, it's good for growth. We know corruption is bad because corruption means that incumbents buy out governments to prevent entry. That's what corruption is all about. So if you reduce corruption, it's a good thing. Now, the problem is that when you reduce checks and balances, you might increase corruption, not reduce corruption. So we will have to see. Freedom is also very important. When you want to do frontier innovation, freedom is not a big deal when you want to catch up. But when you want to do very much frontier innovation, then freedom seems to be important. So we will see if China manages, to remain. Now they are not absolute frontier innovators. They are getting close to frontier, but they are not quite frontier. We will see whether they will keep being as where they are now or become more frontier or less frontier. And there are worries. We'll see. I think one has always to be very careful when talking about China, because one can say it is very easy to be mistaken.
Thank you. So let me go back to at the beginning. You mentioned that contrary to Schumpeter, you're optimistic.
Yeah.
And so with the announcements that have been coming from Glasgow, are you still optimistic about innovation being able to help us in fighting climate change, and with governments doing enough to spur innovation in that dimension?
My view is a fighting optimism. It's not a Panglossian optimism. Pangloss from Voltaire. My optimism is the optimism of a resistant, of a fighter, of someone who says there must be a way out, and we have no choice because we need to survive. So we need to find solutions. That's the kind of optimism that I have. So it's not. I believe that innovation is the way out. Innovation will save us. It's the only way out. It's not negative growth. It's innovation. So that's for sure. I know also that, you have progress in various technologies. Even, for example, on nuclear, to keep the nuclear, the nuclear waste, we are making progress on that as well. That's very important. So you have progress on many things. And I also see that there is the development of this consumer awareness, and the name and shame seems to be working more. I feel also that, it's not one big thing that will do it. It's many steps. You see what I mean? And any step is good to take. And we have to do that. And we need to keep fighting. I would like this to go faster than it goes. But I believe that the young generation and the consumers and the civil society and the green finance, there are many forces there that can play out. And we need to do whatever we can, use whatever we can to, to fight the climate change. I am already happy to know that, in big towns like, I don't think that after 2030, you will have many gasoline cars in Paris, for example. I don't think so. Any progress that you can make there will be very important. And you have to try the best you can. But the only way out is green innovation. Without innovation, we are finished. The only hope for survival is innovation. It's the only hope. It's the only thing we have.
I'd like now to thank you, and I'd like to ask a question for economists. So with COVID, we have seen that quite a few people moved their research to the topic of COVID when it came up, and it was actually quite very sudden, and quite a few people moved in that on the topic.
Yeah,
we don't seem to be seeing the same movement for including environmental concerns in our models. And so what do you think that's the case? Because
right.
COVID is a serious problem, but climate change is something which is
look, I developed with Aaron Asimoglu, by the way, and other co-authors, a model where we put innovation in climate models. And so that was our contribution. And then we kept developing these models. So at least before, the models of environment had no innovation in them. The models that Nordhaus would use or that Nick Stern would use in his report had no innovation in it. So what we did is to introduce innovation and endogenous directed innovation and say how you can direct innovation, this, that. And so at least at my modest level, I tried to change models and I didn't do model of COVID. I worked on model of environment and I put innovation in model of environment. I didn't work particularly on COVID model. The COVID model is interesting in itself. I don't know if they will go very far because the big thing was the vaccine. Let's be honest. The big deal was the vaccine. I mean, what really saves us is the vaccine. So the big problem is to understand why the mass, you had a BARDA in the US and not in Europe. But that brings us back to what we talked about today, because what will get us out of it is the vaccine. I mean, that's the most important. And to understand what is a good ecosystem of innovation. Why France, which has the Pasteur Institute, the first vaccine was in France with the Institut Pasteur, why we were not able to come up with a vaccine, and why the Americans did so well. Why you had also European startups that started in Europe, like Pfizer, and went to the US for financing. Why the head of Moderna is French, but he had to go to the US. That's very important, but that's in our model. That's what we discussed today.
Thank you. So, no more questions. Then I guess that would be the end for today.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank you very much for your lecture and for taking the time to answer these questions.
Thank you.